So read the first question and answer it.
Read it out loud?
No, just silently.
Yeah, I'm all set.
Okay. Then go.
Well, the my meeting with Jonas Salk occurred in 1961 at the 100th anniversary of the founding of Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. And I was assigned to cover the anniversary celebration, which brought together all of the many great people in science, in history, in politics, to MIT for the celebration. And I was sitting at a table getting ready to report on the event, and I looked over my shoulder at a cluster of 3 or 4 or 5 men. They were all men at that time, celebrating the 100th anniversary of MIT. And I saw a very familiar face in this cluster of men. And it was very clear to me that this man that I was looking at was Jonas Salk. And I listened, or rather I watched. And after a few minutes, the group of men broke up, and their conversation being over with, I walked over very boldly to Jonas Salk, who was getting ready to go to a new cluster of men to talk about something else. And I said, Dr. Salk, my name is Tom Grubisich, and I'm a reporter for the Worcester Telegram, and I'm here to cover this great celebration. But I'd like to thank you for discovering and making practical the vaccination for polio. Thank you very much. And I thank you personally, as well as a citizen and as a journalist, because I have the vaccine, and maybe that's why I'm not in an iron lung or walking around with crutches. And he was surprised to begin with, but I think thankful that somebody had the temerity to come up to him at this celebration and say, thank you, Dr. Salk. I mean, he got a lot of thank yous in his life, many of them, and he won the Nobel Prize, I know, for the discovery of the vaccination. And but I think that somebody thanking him personally that day in 1961 meant something to him. And I haven't forgotten about it, of course. How many years later? 57 years later. Quite a memory in my bank of memories.
Cool, so that's the end of the first.
At that time, in the early 60s and the 1950s before that, polio was a very publicly perceived, publicly experienced disease. You were constantly bombarded with photographs, March of Dimes, publicity of showing children in iron lungs, showing children on crutches. The threat of polio, that anybody could get it at any time, and that you might wind up in an iron lung for how long, who knows. It was a very real experience for every, not only for every parent, but for children too, because they saw these images. So you were constantly aware of it. It was happening at the same time that we were in the nuclear scare, where you saw signs on the building that you were walking past, bomb shelter. It was one of those experiences that everybody had. And this was before Twitter. This was before Facebook. But the experience was as massively and as widely perceived as anything that Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest can produce today. As a child in the 50s and as a young adult in the 1960s, I was very aware of polio. Less so was I aware that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio. Not that I didn't know it, but FDR never publicized that he was crippled by polio because it didn't look too good for him as president. But very definitely Franklin Roosevelt had polio, and that drove home for some of us that if Franklin Delano Roosevelt could get it, then any of us could get it too. There was no fear of vaccines in the 1950s, the late 1950s, or the 1960s. Of course, the oral vaccine by Dr. Sabin came in 1965, I believe. But even before that happened, there was no fear about the polio vaccine, just as there was no fear about the smallpox vaccine. Vaccines in the 1950s and in the 60s were considered miracles. Nobody was protesting them for their side effects. Nobody said, I'm not going to get a smallpox vaccine, or I'm not going to get a polio vaccine because it may cause a side effect. That simply did not exist at the time. The issue that we have today about vaccines that has been created in the media with, of course, Twitter and the other platforms of social media, those things simply did not exist at the time when I was a child. I mean, we believed in these miracles of medicine. Penicillin, the miracle of that came out of World War II. And then, of course, all the other things that were invented in medicine. So that was just an era of miracles in medicine, and there was no one that was really questioning these miracles. So it was an entirely different era than what we have today. Today, medicine, there are miracles of medicine that get talked about and written about, but just as often, people are talking about and writing about the failures of medicine. The blowback is pretty widely disseminated. Some people have lost faith in medicine altogether. That's why we have homeopathy. That's why we have all of these natural concoctions, some of which are, of course, highly questionable, but others are not necessarily bad. Medicine has been going through a lot of changes, which are good. I mean, it's not wise to think about medicine as a kind of a simple miracle that we all are going to benefit from. We know that medicine can do some very bad things, not always intentionally, sometimes through just malpractice. We read the other day, for example, of course, that many doctors don't read their lab results very carefully. And as a result, they prescribe things or fail to prescribe things because they didn't read the report on the test very carefully. So there's good reason to be very scrutinizing when it comes to medicine today. But compared to 50, 60 years ago, it's a whole different era. We are beyond miracles in medicine. But when I saw Dr. Salk, we were still in this kind of miracle phase of medicine. And so when I went up to Dr. Salk, I was thanking him as a very special, almost a godlike creature. And maybe Jonas Salk did not want to be treated godlike because I think he knew that he was not a god, but as I said, 50 or so years ago, even if you were a journalist, you tended to look upon medicine and its practitioners as a kind of a godlike profession.
So have we gotten through all four? Have we gotten through all four?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. That should be